Mark and Emily Wilson looked like the perfect couple from the outside. 2 kids, a cozy home, and a life that seemed steady and safe. But beneath the calm surface, resentment was growing like a crack in glass. When Emily finally filed for divorce, Mark's pride shattered completely. Within days, love turned into rage, and the man who once promised to protect his family became the one who destroyed it, pulling the trigger in front of their children on a quiet suburban afternoon. Mark Wilson always seemed like the kind of man who had everything under control. He worked at a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of Detroit, where grease and engine fumes clung to his clothes long after he left work. To his neighbors, he was polite, quiet, and dependable. His wife, Emily, was the opposite, bright, warm, and deeply involved in the local elementary school where she taught. Together, they gave the impression of a normal suburban family raising 2 kids in a modest 2-story home on Meadowbrook Drive. But behind the walls of that home, the sound of love had turned into something hollow and sharp. The first few years of their marriage had been happy, full of small victories and quiet dreams. But over time, Mark's temper started showing in ways that frightened Emily. It wasn't always yelling. Sometimes it was the heavy silence that followed, the kind that made her feel invisible. He had become increasingly controlling, questioning where she went, who she talked to, and how she spent her money. She tried to rationalize it as stress from work, but deep down she knew it was something darker. Mark wasn't just unhappy. He was angry at life itself, and Emily had become his favorite target. The tension grew worse after the birth of their second child, Noah. Emily wanted to focus on the children, but Mark accused her of neglecting him. He drank more often, coming home late, smelling of alcohol and gasoline. On those nights, she would take Lily and Noah to the living room, keeping them busy until he fell asleep in the recliner. It became routine, predictable, and painfully exhausting. The house that once felt like a safe place began to feel like a cage she couldn't escape. By the time their 10th anniversary came around, Emily was already emotionally gone. She had stopped fighting back, stopped explaining herself, and started planning her way out. She didn't want to break the family apart, but she knew staying was slowly destroying her. Every argument ended with Mark's apologies, but they were hollow promises. He would beg her to forgive him, then find something new to blame her for the next week. It was a cycle she couldn't survive much longer. One afternoon, while grading papers at the kitchen table, she finally made the decision that had been forming in her heart for months. She searched online for divorce attorneys in Wayne County. Her hands shook as she typed the words, but the moment she pressed enter, she felt an unfamiliar calm. It wasn't relief exactly, more like the faint light of freedom flickering in a dark room. She made an appointment for the following Monday, careful to do it during her lunch break when Mark wouldn't suspect anything. That weekend, Emily noticed how strange Mark had become. He was quieter than usual, watching her with a look that made her uneasy. He followed her around the house, asking small questions about dinner or the bills, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match his tone. She avoided confrontation, keeping her focus on the children. Lily had a school project and Noah wanted help with a drawing. Those moments with them were the only parts of her day that still felt normal. On Monday morning, she went to the lawyer's office alone. The woman who greeted her was kind, explaining each step of the process and assuring her that she had options for protection if she needed them. Emily didn't think she would. She believed Mark would be angry but rational, that he would eventually accept it. That belief would prove fatal. By the time Mark received the divorce papers 3 days later, something in him snapped. He didn't shout or throw anything, but his silence was worse than any outburst. He sat in his truck after work, gripping the papers so tightly that they tore at the edges. Neighbors saw him sitting there long after dark, staring at the house with an expression no one could read. Inside, Emily tried to keep the kids calm as the air in their home grew heavier by the minute. The divorce had set something in motion that could no longer be stopped. The days following the delivery of the divorce papers felt strange in the Wilson household. The silence carried an edge, a quietness that seemed to hum like static in the background. Mark had stopped talking to Emily altogether. He didn't ask about dinner, didn't mention work, and barely acknowledged the children. He moved around the house like a ghost, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. Emily tried to keep life as normal as possible, making breakfast, helping the kids with homework, and pretending that everything was fine. But deep inside, she could sense something dangerous building behind Mark's blank expression. Mark's co-workers noticed the change in him. He stopped joking around in the shop, barely spoke during breaks, and once, when a wrench slipped from his hand, he slammed his fist into the wall so hard that his knuckles split open. He didn't even flinch. He had always been short-tempered, but this was different. It was as though he was lost in a fog of anger he couldn't see out of. When one of his friends asked if he was okay, Mark muttered something about his wife betraying him and walked away. No one asked again. At home, Emily tried to maintain her distance. She avoided being alone with him and made sure the kids stayed close. She started locking her bedroom door at night, though she never told anyone. Her lawyer had warned her that things could escalate once the divorce became real. She had heard stories about other women, how their husbands became violent when they realized they were losing control. Still, she didn't want to believe Mark could ever go that far. She told herself that he was just hurt, that time would calm him down. But Mark was not calming down. He had begun checking her phone when she left it unattended, memorizing numbers, scrolling through emails. When Emily wasn't home, he searched her purse and went through her drawers. One evening, while pretending to fix a leak under the sink, he found a printed email from her lawyer outlining the terms of separation. That piece of paper felt like a personal attack. He folded it neatly and placed it in his pocket, holding it like proof that she was the one destroying everything. As the week went on, he became more erratic. He followed Emily when she left for work, parking a few cars away from the school where she taught. He watched her from a distance, noting every person she spoke to, convincing himself that she was already moving on. The more he watched, the more his thoughts twisted. He told himself she was humiliating him, turning their children against him, making him look like a failure. Each night he sat in the dark living room with a bottle in his hand, replaying every fight they had ever had. Emily noticed his mood darkening and tried to reach out to her parents, though she didn't tell them everything. She just said that things were tense and that she might come stay for a few days if it didn't get better. But she never went. She didn't want to drag her family into her problems or uproot the kids. She wanted to handle it quietly, to protect everyone from the storm she sensed was coming. One night after the children had gone to bed, Emily heard Mark pacing in the hallway. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved back and forth, muttering under his breath. She held her breath until the sound stopped. When she finally peeked out, he was sitting on the couch, staring at a family photo on the wall. The glass frame reflected the dim light from the television. His face was expressionless, but his hands were clenched tightly on his knees. The next morning, Mark didn't go to work. Instead, he drove aimlessly for hours, ending up outside Emily's school again. He watched parents picking up their children, teachers laughing together, the world moving forward without him. In his mind, he was already the outcast, the man everyone would whisper about. The thought filled him with rage and helplessness. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel until his hand went numb. That night, Emily tucked Lily and Noah into bed and sat alone in the kitchen, reading over the next steps in her lawyer's email. She didn't hear Mark enter the room behind her. He stood in the doorway, watching her quietly for a long moment before walking away without saying a word. She didn't realize that he had already made up his mind, that in his twisted reasoning, if he couldn't have his family, no one else would. The clock on the wall ticked softly as the air in the house grew colder. The morning of the tragedy was ordinary, so deceptively calm that it almost felt peaceful. The sun filtered through the curtains and the smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen. Emily was making breakfast for the kids, flipping pancakes while Lily and Noah sat at the table arguing over who got the blue cup. Mark sat nearby, quiet, staring at his coffee as if lost in thought. He hadn't spoken much for days, but that morning, his silence felt different. There was a stillness in him, a kind of eerie focus that unsettled Emily even though she tried not to show it. She told herself to keep things normal. The kids didn't need to see the tension. She packed their lunches, checked their homework, and tried to fill the air with casual small talk. But every time she glanced at Mark, she saw something in his eyes that frightened her, a cold emptiness she hadn't seen before. When she kissed the kids goodbye and left for school, she didn't notice him watching from the window, his jaw clenched tight. After dropping the children off, Emily went to work as usual. Her students greeted her with cheerful voices, and for a few hours she managed to forget the unease that had followed her all morning. She graded papers, read stories aloud, and tried to smile through the lingering heaviness. She had already decided to move out by the end of the month. The new house she planned to rent wasn't far, just enough distance to start fresh. She was going to tell Mark at the end of the week when her lawyer finalized the custody documents. But while she was teaching, Mark wasn't at work. He had called in sick, telling his boss he wasn't feeling well. Instead of resting, he spent the day in the garage, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and metal. On the workbench sat his old handgun, one he hadn't used in years. It had been his father's, a relic he kept locked away in a drawer. He took it out, cleaned it, and loaded it with slow precision. Each click echoed softly through the quiet space. His movements were calm, deliberate, like a man performing a ritual he didn't quite understand. By the time Emily returned home that afternoon with the children, the house looked perfectly normal. The truck was parked in the driveway and the blinds were half closed. Lily and Noah ran ahead, racing each other to the front door while Emily followed behind, juggling grocery bags. She called out a greeting as she entered, expecting no response. She had gotten used to Mark's silent moods. He was sitting in the living room, the television on, but muted. The glow from the screen flickered across his face. Emily set the groceries on the counter and began putting things away, her mind busy with the small tasks of routine. She didn't notice him stand up, didn't hear his footsteps approaching from behind. It happened quickly in a blur of movement and noise. 3 shots cracked through the stillness, echoing down the hall. Lily screamed and Noah froze in place. Emily collapsed to the kitchen floor, her body crumpling beside the open refrigerator door. For a few seconds there was nothing but ringing silence. Then the sound of Lily's sobs broke through. Mark stood there, gun still in hand, staring at what he had done. The reality of it didn't seem to register. He looked at his wife's body, then at the children who were pressed against the wall, shaking. His expression was blank, almost detached, as if his mind had left his body entirely. Outside, a dog barked. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower hummed. The world continued, unaware of the horror that had unfolded inside the Wilson home. Mark dropped the gun on the floor. It clattered against the tile, the noise startling the children into another round of terrified cries. He took a step back, breathing heavily, then turned and walked out the door. He didn't run. He didn't look back. He got into his truck, started the engine, and drove away, leaving behind the home that had once held every piece of his life. Inside, Lily and Noah clung to each other, too afraid to move, waiting for someone, anyone, to come and make the nightmare stop. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of spilled syrup and pancakes gone cold on the table. The neighbors on Meadowbrook Drive heard the gunshots around 3 in the afternoon. At first no one reacted. It was a sunny day, the kind that brought children outside to play and lawnmowers humming across trimmed yards. A few assumed the sounds were fireworks or someone hammering wood. But then came a scream, high-pitched, desperate, and unmistakably human. Within moments, doors opened and people began stepping out of their houses, confusion turning into fear. When the police arrived, the scene was hauntingly quiet. The front door of the Wilson house was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, the smell of gunpowder still lingered. A half-finished meal sat on the kitchen counter, and 2 small backpacks were dropped by the door. In the middle of the kitchen floor lay Emily Wilson, her body motionless, a dark pool spreading beneath her. Lily and Noah were found in the hallway, clutching each other and crying so hard they could barely breathe. Officers moved quickly, guiding the children outside, away from the sight of their mother. Neighbors stood in shock on their lawns, watching as paramedics entered with stretchers they would not need. The entire block fell under a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of police radios and muffled sobs. One neighbor, Mrs. Parker, who had been close to the family, wrapped a blanket around the children and whispered that everything would be okay, even though everyone knew nothing would ever be okay again. The investigation began immediately. Detectives pieced together what had happened in those few awful minutes. The divorce papers were still on the table just inches away from Emily's hand. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. It appeared she hadn't even seen it coming. 3 bullets fired in quick succession had ended her life before she could react. The gun was found on the floor near the doorway and the shooter was nowhere to be found. Mark Wilson's truck was missing. Within an hour, a statewide alert was issued. Police traced his cell phone, but it had been left behind, still plugged into its charger in the living room. His wallet and keys were gone. A patrol unit was sent to his workplace, but his co-workers hadn't seen him since the previous morning. The mechanic's shop was closed, and his locker was empty except for a photo of his family taped to the inside door. The news spread quickly. Reporters gathered at the edge of the neighborhood, their vans lined up along the curb. They called it a domestic tragedy, a crime of passion, a suburban nightmare. Everyone had their own theory about what had pushed Mark over the edge. Some said it was jealousy. Others whispered that he had always been unstable. No one truly knew how long he had been planning it. That night, police found his truck abandoned at a rest stop 50 miles away. The engine was off and the vehicle was parked near the woods. Officers approached carefully, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Mark was sitting in the driver's seat staring out the windshield, his face pale and blank. The gun rested beside him on the passenger seat. When the officers ordered him to step out, he did so without resistance. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't protest. He simply looked at them and asked in a hollow voice if Emily was gone. When they told him she was dead, he nodded slowly, as if it was something he had already known. At the station, Mark barely spoke. He didn't deny the shooting, didn't offer an explanation, and didn't cry. The only words he repeated were that he didn't mean for the kids to see. Detectives noted his calmness, his detachment, the eerie absence of emotion that made it hard to tell whether he felt guilt or nothing at all. Meanwhile, Emily's family arrived from out of town, grief-stricken and disbelieving. Her parents were taken to identify her body, their tears silent and endless. The children were placed in temporary care, too traumatized to speak. The community held a candlelight vigil outside the school where Emily had taught. Dozens of students and teachers stood together in the evening air, their candles flickering in the breeze as they whispered prayers. By the next morning, the Wilson home had become a symbol of tragedy. Yellow police tape fluttered across the front yard and a single toy lay forgotten near the curb. What had once been an ordinary family house was now a crime scene, and a grim reminder of how quickly love could turn into violence. The trial of Mark Wilson began 6 months after the murder, drawing intense media attention. Every seat in the courtroom was filled on the first day. Reporters lined the hallway, their cameras ready to capture the face of the man who had shattered an entire family. Mark entered wearing a plain gray suit, looking thinner, older, and hollow-eyed. He showed no reaction when the charges were read aloud. First-degree murder, possession of an unregistered firearm, and child endangerment. The prosecutors described him as a man driven by control and rage, unable to accept that his wife wanted to leave. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic experts confirmed that the gun found beside him at the rest stop matched the bullets that killed Emily. His fingerprints were all over it, and his own handwriting was on the torn divorce papers discovered in the house. Witnesses testified that Emily had lived in fear for months, confiding in her lawyer and collecting evidence of Mark's intimidation. The prosecution presented a chilling narrative, a man who viewed his wife not as a partner but as something he owned. When she tried to reclaim her life, he made the irreversible choice to destroy it. The defense tried to argue that Mark's actions were the result of a mental breakdown. They described him as a man under severe emotional distress, unable to control himself after being served with divorce papers. They brought in a psychologist who claimed he had suffered a brief psychotic episode, triggered by feelings of abandonment and humiliation. But the jury heard another story through the evidence, a deliberate act carried out in cold blood. Mark had loaded the gun, waited for his wife to return home, and shot her in front of their children. It was not an accident or a moment of madness. It was a decision. Emily's family attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row. Her parents clutched each other's hands as photos of their daughter were displayed in court, images of her life before the marriage fell apart, and crime scene photos no parent should ever have to see. The most painful moment came when Lily, only 10 years old, testified via video. Her small, trembling voice described how her father had walked into the kitchen and pulled the trigger. The entire courtroom fell silent as she said that she remembered her mother's face, remembered the sound, and remembered her father leaving without looking back. When the verdict was finally read, it took less than 3 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts. There were no cheers, no applause, just the quiet sound of Emily's mother crying softly into her hands. Mark showed no visible emotion. He stood still as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a man who had once controlled everything around him, the sentence was absolute. The bailiffs led him away, and he didn't look at anyone as he disappeared through the courtroom doors. In the weeks that followed, life in the quiet neighborhood of Meadowbrook Drive slowly resumed, but nothing felt the same. The Wilson home was sold, repainted, and eventually rented to another family, but the neighbors never forgot what had happened there. The sound of sirens that day still echoed in their memories. Emily's co-workers organized a memorial at the school, planting a garden of pink roses in her honor. A small plaque was placed there engraved with her favorite quote, "Kindness is the only thing that grows when shared." Lily and Noah went to live with Emily's sister in another state. The community rallied around them, sending letters, toys, and donations. But no amount of comfort could erase the trauma they carried. They were the only living witnesses to the moment their family broke apart, and that memory would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Years later, true crime documentaries would revisit the case, calling it a tragic reminder of how domestic tension can turn fatal. But to those who knew the Wilsons, it wasn't just a headline. It was a wound that never fully healed. Behind the statistics and the legal arguments was a family that had once shared Sunday breakfasts, bedtime stories, and laughter. All of it destroyed in a single moment of rage. In the end, the story of Mark and Emily Wilson became more than just another case file. It became a warning, a plea for those trapped in the silence of fear to seek help before it's too late. The garden at Emily's school still blooms every spring, a quiet symbol of what love and strength can leave behind, even after the worst of tragedies.